Welcome to the Vernuncio Novak Report and the American Political Zone. From New York, this is Frank Vernuncio.
And from Washington, D.C., this is Daria Novak.
And both of us, fortunately, are warm amidst the terrible snow and ice that's befalling the entire country, and in fact, a good part of the Northern Hemisphere as well. And Daria, one of the things that this is exposing is some of the weakness in the electrical infrastructure, both, for example, in the US and the state of Texas, and over in Europe, in Germany. One of the problems they're facing, out of many, of course, with energy, is that the renewables are not as reliable as one would have hoped. In Texas, apparently the story is that antifreeze was not put into the gears, I guess, of the windmills, of the wind turbines. And also, obviously, the solar panels are under a couple of inches of snow, so they're not producing much either.
Yeah, we've got to really look at when we see a grid moving over to green energy, which in concept is good. We all want to see ecological measures that, preserve the world. Nobody's against that, but it's the way that these states are doing it. In Texas right now, they doubled the capacity of renewable energy between 2017 and 2019. Now, what this means is that the state didn't fully develop all of the plans. This is in my opinion, but I've also talked to other people about that and read about it. The same thing happens in California that we saw last year, Frank, as I'm sure you remember. We saw brownouts that were very widespread. There's a difference, though. In California, the electric grid there can bring in energy from other states. Texas's electric grid is basically self-contained within that state. So if some people are saying if they had been able to bring in resources from outside, it would have worked. However, we've seen that this did not work in California. When planners for the grid look at capacity, what they need to do is to look at worst case scenarios. And I don't think that we've seen that in Texas's case. Texas produces about 3/10 of the country's total for renewable energy and uses not quite 20%. So they're exporting some renewable energy, but this is still not enough. Those figures are used to say, oh, they've got an excess. But we saw what happens, just like you said, when the wind turbines are not working and solar panels go down. For Texas, about 90+% of renewable energy comes from wind turbines. Now, if you look at this, and this is sad for people in Texas, during this recent event, people that would normally pay $25 for a kilowatt hour, literally the fee went up to over $9,000 where it's capped. It was actually higher. $9,000 per kilowatt hour to produce energy for Texas. $25 to $9,000, Frank. In this economy, what is that doing to the people of that state? They have coal that's available, but coal mines shut down because electric plants weren't using it. We have thermal energy that's available and natural gas in Texas in addition to the oil there. I think what we need to do is to see states like Texas diversify their sources in order to prevent events like this from happening again.
We are an energy dependent society. The fact is we cannot go for periods when the wind doesn't blow or the sun doesn't shine and simply say we're going to stop everything until the wind blows or the sun shines. Renewables are great as an addition, as an extra to fossil fuels. Unfortunately, they simply are not reliable. And while on a clear day and a windy day, they're all great, the fact of the matter is, as an energy dependent society, we simply can't allow dependence on renewables to destroy the functioning of our hospitals, our schools, and so forth. It simply is not reliable. Is it great? Is it green? Does it help the environment? Yes. But we also have a society to run, a country to run, doctors to do work in hospitals. We need our mass transportation to be working. We need our schools and factories open. And the fact is, until you can prove that renewables can be anything more than a minor addition to regular forms of fossil fuel energy, they simply cannot run the show. We're looking at a country, Germany, which was among the world leaders, perhaps the world leader in renewable energy. And we're seeing that the people there are suffering terribly because of the mistake of over reliance on green energy.
When you look at your base load power, and that basically means the minimum amount that needs to be produced for a particular area, say Texas, Texas was unable to generate that. If they were not relying on green energy, Texas probably in an unusual event like this would have had some issues, but they would not have been as extensive. Now, that's Texas, a very large state. If you look at the New England states that are very heavily dependent on oil, we see that in general, the New England states don't have the same type of trouble. Having grown up in New England, yes, you might be out of electricity for a short period of time when a tree branch goes down, but as soon as that's restored, you've got your own oil supply. New England basically is home fuel oil dependent there. So it's a very different system. I think the biggest problem, Frank, that we need to be talking about in this country is twofold. One, are we going to be able to change over at an efficient cost ratio to these different types of energies? And two, are we able to protect the national infrastructure if we use them? If we change over too quickly, we're not going to be able to prepare for all of the scenarios that could occur. And we'll have another Texas, or we'll have another California set of brownouts. This is unacceptable to the country as far as I'm concerned.
Let's be blunt as well. America under the Trump administration became energy independent in fossil fuels. The solar panels and the wind turbines are largely constructed in, of all places, China, which would make America dependent on its worst enemy. So those are major factors to be considered. And let's not also overstate how green energy actually is. Landfills across the country are now being besieged by all of these wind turbine panels that are no longer good. They're not decomposing. They are filling up our landfills. Solar panels, one of the things, Daria, that you and I have talked about in the past as an environmental issue is basically the use of land for all sorts of non-environmental uses. And when you see solar panels that have to be the size of a small state to supply a reasonable amount of energy, well, you've lost that terrain. You've lost that area. You are destroying whatever wildlife existed before. Wind turbines as well are killing thousands, if not millions of birds each and every year. So let's not over exaggerate how green energy actually is.
You're talking that angle, and my angle is going to come back and say national security. We need to protect the grid. And if we look at what, for instance, China has done in recent times, I am very concerned about this administration currently allowing China to, in a sense, infiltrate the grid in this country. I know that's a dramatic way of putting it, but once again, we have to look at the fact that we are competitors with China, and we're not exactly friendly toward each other at the moment. Given the global dynamics of the world, we could end up enemies of each other and potentially in some type of conflict. How have we protect our critical infrastructure today is important. We cannot just say, well, in the future, if something happens, we'll quickly fix things. We've got China buying into corporations that are involved in energy production in this country. Frank, this is a complex problem, and it's a serious one.
And it has to be taken seriously with something more than bumper sticker soundbite solutions. Daria, let's go to our first guest. Major General Marie Ader, retired, is the former Army Deputy Chief of Public Affairs. She's the author of the new book, American Cyberspace, Trials and Path to Trust. She writes that trust is unraveling across America. General, welcome to the program. We're honored to have you.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
Tell us a bit about the book and why you wrote it.
Well, the book is about trust in institutions, American democratic institutions, from government to business to media to non-government institutions. I wrote it because I have a background in dealing with media and with public communication. And I've been watching this for a long time and looking at how we've had a slow denigration of trust in all of our institutions for at least the past 15, 20 years, although it's sped up considerably in about the last 10. So I wanted to look at the causes of this, and I wanted to look at some remediation if I could get to the point where I could figure out that.
General, sometimes cultures change over time. But when you look at some of the actions in our society, for example, school districts around the country are tossing out schools named after Abraham Lincoln or George Washington. Um, it seems that this is an intentional destruction of trust in the institutions of our country.
Well, I think what we see is the pendulum always swings a little too far in one direction in reaction. The knee-jerk reaction. Let's try to fix something and we go too far, and then we will have to come back. And we see that in almost every area where there is an action taken after a long period of inaction, that it goes too far.
So where do we go from here? I mean, when we look at, for example, the curriculum of our schools across the country, much of it, I think for folks of my generation, at least, is rather shocking. There is a school textbook in Texas which instructed high school students compare the Boston Tea Party to the attack of 9/11 and say why they're the same. My reaction was exactly yours, exactly yours. And it seems that this is an intentional attack on our institutions, on our history, and on our culture.
Sometimes I would think it is intentional too, but oftentimes I think it is either naivete or ignorance that leads people to make some statements that have no basis in reality or even common sense. And I think overall, that's what we're missing in every arena is common sense in how we approach problems.
General, can you tell me this? We hear about foreign nations that are attempting to influence the American population, be it voters or just public opinion. We see disinformation, misinformation, and propaganda. How much do you think the foreign nations, to name a few, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, how much influence do you think they have in this country, and are we prepared to combat it?
Here's the bottom line with all of these things is you and I are on the outside of any studies in this area. And unless you're on the inside or you were a witness to an event, you don't really know for sure. And you must always take the words of others or their views. What I want to see is from our news media is that they show me, tell me how to spot a bot, show me how to find a fake news account. And I haven't seen that until I've been digging. And in September, I found a 25-page report from Facebook on the numbers of Russian accounts they took down and what pages looked like that promoted fake news. That's the first time I've seen that. What I would like to see is every day, certainly there's enough time on CNN since they're on 24/7 and much of it is repetition. Let's have an hour that's tech instruction, or let's be more tech savvy. Here's what's really happening, and we'll show you how and why. Let's have more transparency in how these things are found, what companies are doing. I don't need to know how they found it, but I need to know what it looks like so I can spot it for myself.
Is the mass media and the 24-hour news cycle actually exaggerating some issues? Certainly if one police officer does something bad, it's now extrapolated to every policeman in every part of the United States. The new defense secretary is talking about white supremacy in the military. Yet I've seen studies that indicate this is not as dramatic an issue as the new defense secretary seems to indicate it is. Are we at the point where if everyone in the country does not have the morality of an angel, that somehow our entire society is being condemned?
The military has been combating issues of extremism since the 1980s. And so this is let's take a look. Are we doing the right things in all of our instruction, in our leadership, in how we're managing our programs that help us get away from this? Are we looking at how we bring people into the military that they already have certain tendencies that we think are incompatible with the values of military service? I think that's what we're trying to get at here with this standout.
So where do we go from here when we have our educational institutions basically instructing students and almost an anti-Americanism, when we see the media exaggerate every problem until it becomes, an omnipresent national crisis? How do we restore trust? How do we get a balance so that we look at problems and acknowledge that they exist and that their corrective measures have to be taken, but that the whole country isn't the way it's being portrayed, frankly, by a good portion of the media?
I've taken a lot of looks at how the media portray news, whether we're talking about broadcast news or print. And part of the problem is there's no one, the media, there's no monolith. There certainly is a herd mentality in many cases and a rush to judgment, with the first bull charging and the rest of them following along. And maybe that was a sheep, but you know what I mean. But I think overall there are lots of things the media can do to change. First is it needs to police itself. No, as far as being a profession. How does the media rate itself internally? How does it discipline its members? Can they do that like we have the American Medical Association or even the bar for the legal profession? Let's see some professionalism in how people are educated, trained, and then work. There is so much opinion in everything we see now on all sides. I've gotten to where I read most news stories and I mentally take out all of the adjectives. So I'm just reading, this is what happened, this is what they said. I don't want to hear any other word than said, not exclaimed, cried, sighed, huffed, whatever it may be. I want to hear said. I think the media can also do a number of things in their coverage. We have way too much coverage of celebrities. I do not need to know what Prince Harry is doing. I don't.
Yeah, I think we kind of rode those folks out of here on a rail a couple of 100 years ago. So, um, back in the 1960s, journalism went from who, what, when, where, and why to my opinion is. And I think that's a significant turning point in trust in the media, in trust in journalism, and the ability of individual citizens, frankly, to make up their own mind based on facts, not on someone else's opinion.
And it's so pervasive, you can't tell when it's happened now because it's in everything, every day, everywhere. I still like radio news because it's fast enough and they don't have time. Yes, there's still some of that, but I can tell when it happens. I do think over the past 5 years or so, print media has gotten more serious because they have to survive. And broadcast media has not.
Do you think these same type of things that we're seeing happen in this country are happening in other Western democratic societies when it comes to the media?
To some degree. I know I spent about 8 years in Germany, and I did a lot of teaching about the role of a free press in a democracy to defense officials from the former Soviet states. And their issues with dealing with the free press was that they were horrified there was such a thing, and B, most of them were young and very aggressive, and they were not used to having to defend their thoughts or their decisions. So I think they're settling with this now, but we're still seeing in some of these countries a return to the old ways where there is state-run media and it never sees any criticism. I'll tell you the most thorough media I dealt with was from the BBC. And I thought in many ways the most objective.
Are you concerned when you hear things about Facebook or Google or Twitter basically conceding to foreign governments the right to censor? We know that, of course, Google and Facebook have provided algorithms to the Chinese government so that they can censor out dissent. Most recently, we've heard that I believe it was Facebook was told by Hanoi to censor out people who say things about the Hanoi government that the Hanoi government doesn't like. Now, these are American companies. If we go back to the Cold War era, imagine if the Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, and so forth, if they had said, well, we don't want to offend, Brezhnev, or we don't want to offend Khrushchev, so we're going to take out this offensive content. But that's exactly what our internet, social media are doing right now.
I think we're seeing so much change in all of our tech companies and what they're doing right now. They have made such huge profits in the last year, over $7 trillion. And that's huge market influence. A couple of years ago, the EU instituted its data protection laws to protect privacy. And we all have a role in protecting our own privacy until we get to a point where we're satisfied that companies are doing what they should and that we have government regulation and laws that are supporting this. We're not seeing that here. We're seeing California having passed its law, and that's why you and I are getting all of these announcements. Please agree to our new terms of service. Well, yes, I'll agree to anything, just get me to where I want to go. I don't know what I've agreed to. And now if we're going to have different ones in different states, and other states are also beginning to contemplate laws that say you are censoring conservative speech. If we have all 50 states making different laws about privacy, censorship, and other things about how internet organizations operate, we're going to have a real mess.
Go ahead, Daria.
One of the things I've been wondering about is young people growing up today are faced with all of these challenges trying to determine what's real, what's not real, what they believe from their parents to what they hear from teachers in the school system. Do you think that this younger generation ever can recover, or is it a lost generation in the sense that so much of this media exploded during their lifetimes or their early lives that they're never going to trust anything, authority figures even again?
Even now, we still see that studies show most people trust their parents and their coaches and teachers, most young people. In this generation, however, there is no such thing as privacy because they share everything on social media. Thank goodness I did not have social media when I was in high school and college. It was illegal. And I think that is a big difficulty when they move into the working world and now realize there is such a thing as client confidentiality, or we withhold how we conduct certain business practices, and they don't follow it until they realize they have a problem. One of the things I've seen recently is the FBI has a series of educational programs they've developed for schools in teaching how to be safe kids on social media, how you should avoid these certain sites because there could be bullying, there could be trafficking. And they've done it for grades, I think 3 through 8. Now, this is the FBI developing this for schools. So it's a school resource. So you have government providing a service to a non-government institution, the educational system, because there is not a standardization for that within the educational system. So I think we see sometimes an interlocking of these institutions where one supports or helps the other.
You know, when I was younger, not to date myself, I worked at the State Department on an interagency working group on Soviet disinformation. In those days, we were able to identify and address specific cases that we saw not only in the US, but around the world. It seems to me today that this has proliferated to the point where every time we turn around, do you see the same sort of explosion in these type of problems in recent years or decades?
It's not that there's a proliferation, it's the sophistication that worries me. So can we tell when there is a deep fake video, that a video has been modified? And we need better tools to be able to detect that. So we're starting to see, I think, the rise of organizations that are meant to help figure this out. The University of Washington has a new center called the Center for Public. Oh, now I've got to look. It started when they started a course on calling bullshit, trying to figure out what is real and what isn't, teaching tools to figure that out. So this is called the Center for an Informed Public, and it's a cross section of their schools there, and they look at deep fakes. They look at how photographs are modified. They look at sources of disinformation, and how when people pass it on unwittingly, then it becomes misinformation. Oh, isn't this funny? Isn't this cute? And we send it on without realizing what it is or what it really means. So I think we need more of this type of educational support to figure out what's going on.
What about the issue of outright censorship? There used to be a time when most of us worried about the government censoring what was being done. You know, if you were in a totalitarian country, a communist country, now we're finding it's the private sector in terms of Facebook or Twitter or Google that's engaging in censorship on its own. Our institutions, the First Amendment and so forth, at this point seem legally inadequate to address the censorship of private organizations. Some time ago, I wrote an article in the Washington Times which said that we should treat Facebook and Twitter like common carriers. And John, later, if I went to my local airport and said, you know, I want to fly, and they said, well, we read your last column in the newspaper, we don't like it, you're not getting on my plane. Should we have something similar to that in social media?
I was recently talking to someone about Section 230 of the
Mhm.
Communications Decency Act and how that affected telephones. That as a platform, phone companies said, we're not responsible for what people say on the phone. How does that translate to social media with these platforms? I think what we've seen them do recently with censorship or with throwing people off their platforms probably is done with algorithms, artificial intelligence, and it's a bit heavy-handed, to put it lightly.
To put it lightly, indeed.
So there has to be much more fine-tuning, sophistication, and certainly another look at their responsibilities for their platforms.
And of course, the telephone company never said we don't like that conversation, so we're hanging up on you right now.
Right.
Thank you so much. Tell us one more time about the book, where people can get it.
Sure. The book is called American Cyberscape. It's actually started as a compilation of essays that I had started to write because I have feelings about this kind of stuff. So when it was done, it became a book and it's now on Amazon.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. We look forward to speaking with you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It is interesting, Daria, how, you know, we look at other things like the telephone company or, you know, other avenues in the past, and we've just never really, I think, realized that as social media grew more intensive, more pervasive in our society, that the practices of, say, a phone company or a transportation company didn't seem to be applying to social media.
You know, growing up with a single black telephone with the heavy cord wrapped around, you know, the heavy unit that you picked up, and it was rarely used because it was only if somebody died that you communicated this way out of state, and there were charges for long distance. I've seen everything from that really early, I am really dating myself, Frank, from that early time. I mean, my dad built a table and that phone sat in the hall and it was really reverent. It had its own table, to now where everybody, anytime, 2-year-olds can pick up a phone or pick up one of these iPads or whatever the technology is and seem to communicate with people. We've really lost control, Frank, over any means that we have to protect our children from these types of communication, to protect ourselves, as the general said, from things that are really false that are out there. I think we are in deep trouble until we really learn how to take it to the next level and say something like, we still need to have the freedoms that we need in this country, but we need to ensure that others aren't causing problems for us.
Yeah, and in the marketplace of ideas, I think the difference between censoring out, say, influence from communist China or from Vladimir Putin, you know, and what we're used to is that this isn't an exchange of ideas. This is indoctrination. I mean, recently, President Biden stated that he was no longer going to be expressing governmental concern about Confucius Institutes on college campuses. So now you're having the Chinese government directly influence our students. And I think this type of information, without any kind of counterpoint being available. So you have colleges, for example, where the communist Chinese can influence our students, but if a conservative oriented student objects, he or she is basically ostracized. You're told that you are offending someone's feelings by saying that Chairman Mao was a murderous SOB whose thoughts should not necessarily be persuasive in the United States. So the it seems that our information flow has tilted in favor of our enemies, in favor of those who hate freedom, as opposed to America, which of course has always cherished it.
Well, earlier I talked about misinformation and disinformation campaigns. What we need to recognize in this country, China probably is one of the largest, but there are other countries such as Russia and Iran, North Korea. But from a Chinese perspective, they have a long-term goal, and it's been stated explicitly. They want to remake the world in China's image. It's simply that simple. And what happens is, our Western way of life does not look like what China wants for the world. China is a patient country, and it thinks in terms of generations. We tend to think in terms of quarters for business, or monthly reports, or 4-year election or 2-year election cycles. We don't have that long-term view. So when we see something, we see a Confucian Center that looks like, oh, they're going to show some nice movies about Chinese culture. But what we don't see that our children are experiencing is what are the programs, the long-term programs that China is attempting to push through. Right now, there are over 5,000 kindergarten through 12, high school level, K to 12, that have programs in them that have been written by the Chinese Communist Party. Now, this is not cross-cultural information as it's being portrayed. It's giving a false impression of what communism in China is like today. Now, Frank, you and I have talked about the Uyghur minority, basically a Muslim group out in Western China that in essence is experiencing genocide by the Chinese Communist Party. The Chinese government doesn't want any potential oppositions. They want to have sole power and authority. This is expanding in China. Just one other point. There's a Hainan Island, has 10,000 Muslims on it. Peace-loving people that have never done anything, very traditional. They've been closing down the mosques, censoring the people, and anytime there's any Muslim phrases praising Allah, they have a sticker that goes over that says Dream China. The reason I'm mentioning this is Dream China is coming to the United States. China is attempting to remake its image, especially in this COVID era, where China has released this virus to the world and is now suffering PR image problems. We have to recognize that China has active programs with large numbers of people and a large amount of money that they can contribute to this effort. And it is certainly not an effort at free speech, transparency, or any type of openness or truth. This is solely a Communist Party effort to remake the world in China's image. And that means they have to change the United States, and they have to change the next generation here. That's scary.
We are in an era where the operators of concentration camps in China have unlimited access to the American people, while the school system is taking the name of George Washington and Abraham Lincoln off of school buildings. This is a world turned upside down. And I think the challenges we face are attributable to both, I think, the leftist influence over social media and the fact that leftist influence in our school system has gone way overboard. In an upcoming edition of usagovpolicy.com, Judge Wilson has a good article talking about the influence of the hard left on teachers' unions. And when you read the curriculum that is available, not just in universities, but frankly in kindergarten as well, straight up to grammar school and high school, I think it's very frightening for the future of this country.
I was shocked at what I saw at the university level when I've either taught at or visited different universities in this country. parents really need to be very actively involved, especially at the younger grades, but they also have to recognize that their 18-year-olds that go off to college are not prepared to in general, fully understand and defend the Constitution, defend our way of life, defend our culture. And they are literally being indoctrinated at the college level, at the graduate school level. It is almost across the board.
Daria, let's go to our next guest. Patrick Wood is the founder and director of Citizens for Free Speech, a nationwide nonprofit organization dedicated to protecting and defending the First Amendment. Patrick, welcome to the program.
Hey, Frank, thank you for having me.
I think you are a man who is very, very busy at the moment. We are seeing more and more where those who are in the center or on the right are being kicked off social media, where news organizations are openly portraying leftist perspectives, even those that are overtly incorrect, as being the only opinion out there. What have you been doing to address that crisis?
Well, what we're trying to do in general is defend and support the First Amendment in America. And we all know that it's under tremendous attack right now. Every single element of it. There's 5 elements from churches being told how to worship and how to open their doors for Sunday service, et cetera, to rallies not being able to be held, et cetera. All of these things are direct attacks on the First Amendment. I do not believe this is just incidental, that it just happened and, oh yeah, by the way, the First Amendment's having some trouble. I think this is a purposeful, coordinated attack to destroy communication in America. And if this happens, of course, when communication stops, that's when the fighting begins. And we cannot risk this kind of future in America.
Now, there was a time when First Amendment concerns, whether in the United States or in other parts of the world where they don't have a First Amendment but desire free speech, was between the citizenry and the government. But now it seems clear that the immediate challenge to free speech in America comes from social media, from the internet and social media barons. So how do we legally contest what Facebook or Twitter or Google are doing?
Well, there's the governor in Florida, for instance, has stood up for his state to recommend that his state legislature impose fines against these big media giants for anyone who cancels or deplatforms a legitimate candidate in Florida will be subject to $100,000 a day fine per incident. Things like this, states' rights could be asserted across the country. We don't need to wait for the federal government to come in and save us from this thing. They're not going to, as a matter of fact. They haven't yet, and they're not going to do it, apparently, even now. But the states could do a tremendous amount.
Patrick, one thing I was wondering about, I've read a lot of books on the media through the years. If we look at political conflict in the media or free speech from the late 1800s into the early 1900s, we saw a lot of what I would call ugly speech, a lot of character satire in cartoons. It isn't as if this country is just now facing something new with conflict of interests or whatever, political interests in the media. What has changed that we are no longer able to accept the fact that debate is good, conflict within certain bounds, nonviolence is good? Why can't we understand anymore that the expression of free ideas has made us who we are today?
Well, we should. I think a lot of Americans do appreciate that. And this is absolutely true. The founders of our Constitution knew what they were doing when they put the First Amendment first. They said, if you can communicate and keep civil discourse going, you can maintain a constitutional republic. If you don't, you won't. And here we are. So this is not really an option at this point. If we want to keep our country together as we've known it for the past 200 years, we must restore civil discourse. But there's another thing going on here too, which relates directly to COVID. I think that probably ought to be mentioned, and that is the right for people to have informed consent as to whether or not they're going to treat their body with this, that, or the other, whether it's a vaccine or wear a mask or whatever. Any type of medical intervention requires informed consent. And this is written into law all throughout the United States, in federal down through the states. It's also in the Nuremberg Code from 1947. And when it talks about informed consent, listen to some of the descriptors that are used in the Nuremberg Code. It says, without the intervention of any element or force, fraud, deceit, duress, overreaching, or other ulterior form of constraint or coercion. But that is very clear. But what's happening now is that all of the dissent about what's happening with the pandemic is completely censored. It's just gone from the internet, and it's really getting mean-spirited at this point. These are people breaking the law, doing this to withhold information from people who are due the right to informed consent.
Why does it seem that this concept of offensive speech, that you cannot be offended, that you should be protected from hearing something you disagree with, has become so in vogue? You know, let's go over throughout American history some of the offensive ideas that at the time, perhaps the type of folks who are easily offended today would have been offended at the time. King George is a tyrant. That was offensive to a lot of people in our country. Slavery is a terrible thing. That was pretty offensive to about half the country. Segregation is bad. Women having the right to vote, that offended a lot of people. Why does it seem that during the past decade or so, the concept of an idea that you don't like or haven't really thought of very much, that you should be protected from the expression of an idea?
This is simply just an expression of the cancel culture. There is no rhyme or reason that people should be censored for what they're, at least on an individual level, that people should be censored or self-censored. It's just that if somebody doesn't like you, or they decide you say the wrong word, they get triggered, and then they come after you as a mob to try to destroy your life. This is really a cultural malady we're facing here.
Isn't it a reflection of the, oh, I'm sorry, Jerry, go right ahead.
It just made me think of something. From the other perspective, why would I want to see this done? If I was a socialist, a communist, extreme progressive liberal, everything that we've just talked about is exactly what I would want to see done, because I could then make the population docile, the population afraid to take risks, which is something Americans have been able to do for as long as we've been America. We're risk takers, we're inventors, we're can-do. This literally seems to be not only an attack on the free speech in this country, but Patrick, isn't it an attack on our very way of life, our existence as a culture in a free society?
You're absolutely right. And it does spring from civil discourse. When people don't have the right to communicate with one another, that's when the fighting starts, always. This is a truism, by the way. This is not a political science, idea. When a couple that are married, for instance, when their communication stops, that's when the lawyers get the phone call. I want to get rid of that person, that woman or that man, whatever. They won't communicate with me anymore. I can't deal with it. That's when the fighting starts. So when a people across our country, when a people are prevented from communication, all across society, you're going to have the knives come out and people are going to start fighting. And that is exactly what we see today.
I want to follow up on Daria's excellent point. You know, throughout the past, 105 years or so, socialism, wherever it's been tried, in whatever country, whatever continent it's been enacted on, has failed. It's produced more oppression, more poverty, more despair. to Daria's point, it would seem that if you are a socialist, if you are on the hard left, the thing you want to do is prevent any kind of real open discussion of that reality. Now we see the relatively hard left folks in universities, social media, and so forth. They don't want that open discussion because doesn't it reveal the failures of their political perspective?
Well, I think the issue goes deeper, especially with big media right now, big tech. And here's why I say that. If you look at a Jeff Bezos, if you look at a Jack Dorsey, if you look at a Mark Zuckerberg, you can call them a lot of things, but it's really hard to call them a communist or a socialist. That's not where their mind is at. These people are more likely to be labeled as technocrats, not socialist or communist. That means that they basically worship a god of science where they can control things through engineering and science rather than by old traditional means of controlling people. And this hammer that's coming down on America to censor free speech and to destroy the First Amendment is uniformly coming from this crowd, and they're not just independently now, they're also working together as a pack, which makes it triply dangerous.
Although I would say that the essence of most socialist regimes is that there is an elite group that for themselves getting rich is great, but it doesn't really apply to the great mass of citizenry. Bernie Sanders has made a great deal of money. If we adopted his political philosophy, none of us would be able to make a lot of money, but it's good enough for him, not good enough for us.
He did make a lot of money, didn't he? Especially on his book. Okay.
So, in the last election cycle, we saw, and this goes to your point exactly, where the technocrats of the media and the political left essentially worked together to censor out information to portray only one side of the story. People supporting Donald Trump, for example, had a very hard time expressing their point of view on Facebook or Twitter or Google. When you turned on CNN or MSNBC, the news was not just slanted, but perhaps almost slanderous, as well as just cutting out half the story. How do we address those type of challenges?
Well, within the ranks of Citizens for Free Speech, we're a nonprofit 501c3 organization. What we're trying to do is to retrain people on how to successfully engage in civil discourse in their local community to start taking back and cleaning house where they live. We believe that this is going to be the bottom-up cleaning of America that needs to take place, not top-down, because heaven knows Washington ain't going to save us. They haven't, and they're completely impotent right now to do anything for the people out here in the country. So we're training people on how to engage in civil discourse in their local environment. And we're also teaching them ways that they can educate their other fellow citizens in their local areas and stuff to do things, for instance, to take the face mask off and quit the social distancing nonsense. This, by the way, is just a blatant attack on the First Amendment. Wearing face nappies is just the antithesis of freedom of speech. This has to stop, and it has to stop on a local basis first.
Whatever one's views of those things having to do with COVID-19, it's interesting. If I went on Facebook today on my page and I said, China has spread COVID around the world, it's time we take action against them. Perhaps we should throw out all their companies and all their financial organizations from the United States. I stand a good chance of being tossed off Facebook. On the other hand, if I wanted to praise China, despite the fact that they're operating concentration camps, despite the fact that they're a military threat to the entire Indo-Pacific region, I would face absolutely no penalties whatsoever. How do we get Facebook and Twitter and Google perhaps most insidious because they represent a false view of reality by producing only one type of search results in their first couple of pages? How do we get that resolved? How do we get that one-sided perspective out of the public square to allow us to do what Americans have always done, have good, vigorous conversations?
Well, in the meantime, that's not going to happen because I don't think anybody's going to muscle Mark Zuckerberg around to do the right thing or a Jack Dorsey to do the right thing. There are alternative platforms that have popped up that are gaining in popularity. I think people, if they don't like the Facebooks of the world, they need to go to these other platforms and support people that support them ideologically and give them your money, give them your advertising, et cetera. We don't have to make a practice of living on Facebook and living on Twitter, for instance, or living on Google for that matter. There are alternative search engines in the world. You can make use of those instead of going to Google and just be open to manipulation.
Section 230 allows special exemptions for social media. Should Section 230 be repealed?
If it were possible that an impotent Congress would repeal Section 230, yes. But they haven't, and I don't believe they're going to. And as the governor in Florida now has just recently stood up to the plate, you don't need the federal government to assert states' rights to remove liability from these people to be sued. And I think that this is the first volley in Florida. I think state governors across the nation should stand up and say, we don't care what the federal government has on Section 230 or anything else. We, the states, are going to protect our people, our citizens, and we're not going to allow this to happen, and just start slapping these people with fines until they're absolutely silly. They will learn a lesson sooner or later when the entire, if half the country were in such a mood at that point that they simply could not ignore it anymore, it's costing them way too much money, they will be hurt.
You know, Patrick, I agree with what you said about going through the state level. But here's my question. We see the progressive left and others that don't want to have the type of free speech we're talking about get funding that's massive, have backing of groups, very organized, work on this every day of the year. What organizations are out there in addition to yours? Where do people go today in order to organize at the state level? Because we know what that means. People are going to have to call legislators, visit their state houses, put pressure on the politicians in order to have free speech. What do we need to do?
Absolutely. There are several organizations already around the country that are based within a state that are doing exactly what you just suggested. In Ohio, for instance, there's an organization called Ohio Stands Up. There's also one in Arizona called Arizona Stands Up. And stand-up movements across the country are popping up. I don't know how many states actually have such a movement yet, but these are designed to do exactly what you suggest. That is to sue, either to sue the governor to rescind these mandates and stuff and put their state back on the map again, let the people go, or to sponsor legislation within the state houses to remedy these things. And there's a lot of stuff I believe that's going to happen in the next 4, 5, 6 months. I would say look for the movement called, whatever your state is, Stands Up, and you'll find a group of people that are fighting to take the state back.
You know, that's really good news, because sometimes I think that our side, if you want to call it a side, but those of us who support free speech are busy with our families, we're busy going to work, and politics takes a backseat to some degree. We're not professional politicians. So knowing where to go to organize, I think, is critically important these days.
I agree with you. And we encourage any American that understands that the essence of the First Amendment and free speech in general to join with us. We don't charge anything for our membership, by the way. Free speech ought to be free. But if you join an organization and you want to become a volunteer on top of that, you're welcome to, and we'll give you additional resources and stuff that will help you accomplish some things in your local area. We hear this over and over again. What can I do? What can I, personally, what can I do to make a difference? this is kind of a change these days. 2 years ago, it's, well, what can somebody else do? I don't want to do anything, but what can somebody else do to make things right? Now it's getting down and personal, where individual people are starting to wake up and saying, you know what, I need to get out and do something. This is probably one of the most hopeful things that I've heard in a long time.
Patrick, where can our audience get in touch with you and find out more about your organization?
Well, it's easy to find our website. It's citizensforfreespeech.org, just like it sounds. There's no spaces, hyphens, or not the number, citizensforfreespeech.org. And they can join right on the home page and, noodle around. We've got lots of resources and stuff that might help people immediately get some satisfaction. And otherwise, we hope that a lot of more people will come.
Thank you so much. We look forward to our next conversation.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And Daria, before we close out, I just want to say that a true pioneer in the radio business and a true hero for free speech and for Americanism died today. Rush Limbaugh, rest in peace.
We welcome our newest radio affiliate, Net Talk America in Washington, D.C. at 96.7 FM. We're broadcast throughout the United States on radio and television and worldwide on the web. Watch us on Roku, public broadcast stations, and on the AM/FM 247.com network. You can access the program anytime on our website at usagovpolicy.com. Join us again next week. We're sponsored by the New York Analysis of Policy and Government, a division of the American Analysis of News and Media, Inc., at usagovpolicy.com and the Institute for American Politics. Email us at truthinradio@gmail.com.
Producer, it's the amazing Abigail White, and our director is the